Thank you, Floris. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I didn't really expect such a turnout for something that is often seen as so dry. I just moved to Belgium, so I think I should open with a reference to a Belgian sinologist, Simon Leys, who described the work of munching your way through all these Chinese policy documents as swallowing buckets of sawdust and chewing down rhinoceros sausage. This is basically what we are going to be doing today, so I hope you brought your good set of teeth with you. Because this is also what Chinese officials do. And so what I want to do today is discuss politics. And this maybe is a disappointment for those of you who thought I was going to give an economic lecture, because the 5-year plan is an economic policy document, but I'm not an economist, so I can't do that. So you'll have to make do with my political talk. But I hope that after we've discussed what this is and how it works, all of you can then apply that knowledge to do the economical work yourself. That saves me a lot of effort, but also that will allow you to process the news and the policy as it comes along, and as the specialists discuss the particular issue areas like artificial intelligence or energy or any other sector which I'm not equipped to deal with, but which all depend on this one big document, which is produced every 5 years. Because the Chinese system is a system based on documents and numbers. And so, yes, the question always is, the question always you have to ask when you talk about these documents is, what is this document? Because there are many documents, there are many articles, many newspapers. I mean, many of you here might have seen an exciting article from the Global Times, this exciting tabloid from China with big headlines saying all kinds of outrageous things. But of course, the Global Times is not an official party newspaper. It has a function and a role, but it doesn't stand for the authoritative opinion of the party. Other documents do. And so the document which has one of the highest importances in this Chinese system for the officials on the ground when they make Chinese policy is the 5-year plan. And so what does it look like? This is what it looks like. Because I don't think many of the news broadcasts which discuss the 5-year plan will show it to you. And there's a good reason for that, because it is not very pretty and it doesn't really translate well to the audience. What most people think of when they hear the word 5-year plan are the numbers. And we do have the numbers here. The blue thing over there discusses the quantitative targets for the coming 5 years in China. These matter, these are important, but this is just a very small section of it. The real work happens in the text. And so I've given a small screenshot of the introduction, but there's just reams and reams of text of policy concepts. So the 5-year plan is not a punch card which you put into the Dutch street organ so it can start playing the tune automatically. It doesn't work like that. It's not a target which you set and then everybody begins to run. It is a set of concepts, policy words. Like maybe people here working in Brussels, like I now do, might remember the word green growth or global gateway. Dutch people might know about bestaanszekerheid or box 3. These are all very difficult words if you just string a whole document together full of box 3 bestaanszekerheid, hypotheekrente aftrek, all these things which, again, like you don't even understand them if you don't speak Dutch, but you don't need to, because even if I would translate them for you, it wouldn't make sense to you. But to anybody used to following Dutch politics, you know the whole discourse behind green growth. Green growth is supposed to integrate the idea of climate transition and industrial growth and the concerns of the business lobby as well as the EU's reality, right? And so this whole document, the 5-year plan, is basically that. The sawdust, which I mentioned just now, are the words which you only know if you studied them before. And that is also why, on the one hand, this document is so important, but also why it's so difficult to understand if you are not a specialist in Chinese politics. Because it signals all the priorities. And you can see that the right thing is not actually in the 5-year plan. The right here is one of the many guides you will see on Chinese social media or elsewhere that try to help Chinese people make sense of this document. This is the Xinhua graphic, so this is the official state press agency. And this one tries to organize these concepts in a logical structure for the also overwhelmed Chinese reader to make sense of it. And so this is also what I think we can do maybe a little bit today, But first, I think I want to explain a little bit about the place of the 5-year plan in the Chinese system. Because China is a party state. And we always say this very, very often. We still see, when we turn on the press broadcast of the People's Congress, all the imagery, the red, the hammer and the sickle, maybe even sometimes the Communist International. But what does this mean in the era of Xi Jinping? Because under Mao Zedong, China was a socialist planned economy. So the 5-year plan in the Maoist period was much more like the punch card we just described. It was much more the case that something called the State Planning Commission was in charge of steering how the Chinese economy worked, literally giving factories numerical targets for how much they produced, how many hinges, how many square meters of glass, how many tons of steel, down to the last nail, so very often. This has changed. China is a socialist market economy now. And so we've been talking a lot about the market component the last few years. This is important, obviously, because a lot of Chinese growth does happen under market conditions. But we also have to remember the socialist part of this term. And this is what comes to the fore every time we have the 5-year plan. But a lot has changed now. So the State Planning Commission has been renamed. Now it's the National Development and Reform Commission. It's still the same organization, different name, different function. Whereas the SPC used to be the one literally controlling the economy together with local bureaus at the provincial and municipal level, the NDRC guides the economy, or rather guides economic development, sets the conditions, and so on. And so the 5-year plan also has evolved with that. The 5-year plan is now much more a vision document. As Floris also opened his opening today, it tells a story of what China wants to be. And so it can tell us a lot when we read it. And we should read it if we are officials, at least read part of it. But we have to be quite careful because these are difficult words. Also, your average Chinese citizen won't understand fully. Because these are documents full and dense with meaning. And the meaning comes from, like I said, the party state. So it's still a lot of Marxist ideas in there. The density also comes from the way that any bureaucracy tends to write, especially one as controlled as the Chinese. But it also comes from the fact that these are code words referring to long discussions, right? And so when we see every 5 years in March, the National People's Congress adopt a 5-year plan with overwhelming majorities, with 90%, 99% people voting in favor. We rightfully call this parliament a rubber stamp, because at this moment the National People's Congress is a rubber stamp. But it rubber stamps a document which was produced with a lot more input and discussion than people often seem. It's just that the discussion and the research happens at an earlier stage. So as the previous 5-year plan is running its course, the research and the evaluation into its effects begin. And so you get party researchers, but also from these academics and think tankers who write all kinds of reports within the bounds of Chinese very limited system, and these limits have become worse under Xi Jinping. So there's much less space now to write about these things, but there is still a lot of discussion happening. That then feeds into the policy process, into the party center. And then the process begins which called fermentation. I'll come back to that later. And what the result of this is that a document is drafted at the party center, which is then adopted at the Central Economic Work Conference to give the notion of party democracy, and then the Politburo approves it. And then after the party has approved it, then it goes to the National People's Congress for adoption. And it is only the first step, because this is a process at every level of Chinese government. So the provinces do the same, right? So there's also a Guangdong 5-year plan, which also is going to be adopted now in a short while. And also at the city level, there's also a 5-year plan. And so the whole system will work through this thing based on feedback, what went well, what are China's strengths from the previous 5 years, based on the idea where they want to go, and trying to find a way of going from where they were to where they want to be. And so this is not a democracy as we understand it, because China is run by a Marxist party. And of course, any Marxist-Leninist party is a scientific organization which knows better than you what your real interests are. Right? This is the distinction between subjective and objective interest, if anybody here is a Marxist-Leninist. But the idea is that you get the subjective input from the people, and then you scientifically turn it into their objective interests as determined by the science of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and Xi Jinping thought. Right? And so this is also part of what China now praises as whole process democracy. Right? So China will say that actually this is more democratic because we don't have subjective factors disturbing it. We don't have money and politicians creating nonsense. This is the party deciding based on science and input from the people what is objectively better for them. The reality, of course, is difficult because there are many different views, even among economists, even among Marxist economists, about what the best course of action is, right? And so the solution, of course, for that is democratic centralism. Officially, this is China's inter-party democracy. The idea being that there is democracy, meaning there's freedom to debate within China's limits. But once there's been a decision, you have to stick to the party line, right? So now the whole process of drafting this 5-year plan is both a feedback process, also an indoctrination process. Right? So you have study sessions with lower level officials, with the legislators who have to vote in favor of the 5-year plan all over the country, also in Beijing at the end. And this is as much to get their feedback as also to explain to the lower party cadres what they are supposed to understand about this 5-year plan. This is what Wu Guoguang and other people described in other contexts as yunyang, as fermentation. The idea being that you have this give and take in which it's very dialectical. Again, I'm sorry, this is very Leninistic today. This is the topic, but it's a very dialectical process in which you take the input from the lower levels and you also then explain back to them what they really mean and also what is best for them. And so in the course of this process, by the time they all vote yes, they do so because theoretically speaking, they have come to the understanding that this is the scientifically best way to take China for the next 5 years. Of course, the reality is much more complicated because a lot of people disagree, and ultimately, this is politics. I don't agree with the idea that you can decide politics scientifically. I think there are also value judgments, and there are things you can't predict, but this is the idea behind it. And so I think also when we discuss the 5-year plan and China's system, we have to also do this from the realization of how they understand it. Right? What is the idea behind it for them, not for us? And there is a whole thought process behind it. And it has been, I guess, if you look at the Chinese development so far, had a measure of success. So we should understand why it's successful as well. All right. I think this is the topic that most people thought I was going to talk about today, which is what actually is in the 5-year plan. Because most of the reports you read about the 5-year plan are about artificial intelligence targets, industrial goals, and growth numbers. And I think I'm not doing this partially because I'm not an economist, but also partially because I think this is less interesting to do today. Because these are things I think you can also read yourself. Maybe you should go read the 5-year plan when you go home, or maybe you should just listen to one of the many podcasts by people in their issue area talking about the 5-year plan. But I want to talk a little bit more about how to read it. Because do you remember what I just opened with, the table of content, right? All these Chinese characters. These are some of the headings translated. There are after the introduction, there are 16 headings setting out Chinese general policy direction. And so this is very clear, right? Now we know what to do. You're a Chinese official in the province. You've taken the document home. You read this. You know what the focus is now. Why? Why do you know that? Well, it's also because you will have a study session with your superiors, right? So Chinese officials have weekly or monthly study sessions with documents, including the 5-year plan, right? And so if they don't know what the word means, somebody will explain to them. And so let's try that today. I can be just your party secretary, we can be the Leiden University Party Committee weekly study session. I hope you did your homework. I hope you're a party member in good standing, because they have apps also nowadays for you to do the studying at home. But I'll help you through the words. So the first heading, so again, in the Chinese system, this is important because the hierarchy signals priority, right? So the first heading of the substantive part of the 5-year plan is construct a modernized industrial system, consolidate the foundations of the real economy. So, yes?
What's the real economy?
Good question. Yeah, right. So just now I mentioned the idea of the green growth and how the word green growth refers to a whole policy discussion in Brussels about the way we integrate development and climate transition. Real economy is also one of these key words, which especially people like Xi Jinping like, because it refers to things you can touch. Xi Jinping is quite classical for a certain kind of Marxist who fetishize the idea of industrial creation. It's also linked up with gender, I would say, but the idea being that the West went awry, in part, especially America, by moving away from making things you can touch and going into services, into these soft feminine things, or into luxurious indulgences, things you don't need to make, right? So real economy refers to mainly things like manufacturing, things that are economically useful, and that also to China provide a basis, because it's linked in the same thing to modernized industrial system. Another key word, which refers actually not necessarily as much to the high-tech industry per se, but also to what China calls traditional industries. Because China has been very strong, China was very strong when we were still kind of arrogant, thinking that we would be leading the world and China would be our factory. China was very good in the base industries, right? Steel, now we know also rare earth minerals, plastics, and the assembly of things like that, right? And the idea in the West was that we move up the value chain, right? So we dump the low value added industries like steel making or whatever into these cheaper, lower wage countries. And then we keep adding, we bring the steel to Germany, and then we put in the high-tech internal combustion engine, right? So we capture most of the value added in the automotive industry by keeping the high-tech component in Germany, and everything else we dump in China. And this is the traditional industries. And so since then, what we have noticed is that China has gotten really good at the high-tech industry as well. And so, for example, Germany's treasured internal combustion engine is quite useless now. We all moved to electric vehicles. And in fact, for the Chinese viewpoint, they managed to get to that high level also because they have this traditional industrial base. So the notion in China is also that in order to achieve a modernized industrial system, you need to both move up the value chain and do more high-tech industry, but at the same time also upgrade your traditional industry. So to ensure that the steel making and the assembly and the mineral processing also is upgraded to ensure that it can stay in China and doesn't go to cheaper countries in the region. So China maintains the whole supply chain within the country. And so again, like, I'm not giving you a whole talk about these things, right? So this is just 2 words, 2 phrases, and we can have a whole discussion about all the policy thinking behind this. So yes, Rogier?
It raises some really interesting thoughts also in terms of how the Chinese government thinks about the economy, which we see as primarily a sort of a driver for growth expressed in GDP and share market value, but also in terms of efficiency versus effectiveness. And we see that now with the energy crisis, where China has for years maintained a less efficient energy sector, but one that is resilient to crisis.
Yes.
Whereas we have streamlined this to the bone, so it's very efficient when it works, but when sand comes in the machines, suddenly it breaks down, and it can break down catastrophically.
You see, so there is a very different economic philosophy behind this, and these are all factors which are expressed also in the debates behind these terms, right? So none of this would be incredibly surprising if you had been swallowing all the sawdust the past few years. But it's just not very pleasant, right? And even for many Chinese people, they don't like to spend their time reading party documents, right? Again, if it's written in Chinese, doesn't mean that Chinese people can just read it like that, because they also need to learn the notions behind it. So there's a whole bunch of these things which we can discuss, and maybe we can discuss them also in the Q&A, because again, my point was not necessarily to go into the depths of each discussion behind each term, because there's just so much more here. I mean, new quality productive forces. I think to me, to Rogier, of course, they are very familiar because Rogier works on that. So if not careful, he's going to hijack the lecture and talk about it. But there's just one of the many things in there, right? There's digital China. Again, that sounds more like something which Brussels would come up with, but China also has these things. And that also discusses artificial intelligence, right? The need for China to overcome constraints in AI, again, by relying on its industrial strengths. And so we can do this for 60 more headings. And then, of course, once you actually read the paragraphs, which we won't do today, you can repeat the whole thing over and over again. But this is necessary to understand, because this is also, through these discussions, we get to the concrete actions, right? I can leap onto what we discussed just now to have some general conclusions, what we are seeing in the 5-year plan, because of course it is possible to make a kind of impression of what we are seeing here, right? And so this actually is, I'm very sorry, a very boring 5-year plan. More boring than the previous ones. In some ways, because there's not so many new words in there, right? So these code words, which I discussed just now, are always introduced. And then they are discussed, and then they make it into a 5-year plan after these few years to signal that we have reached a new level. But what we see now actually is that Xi Jinping has had a few 5-year plans to introduce his new ideas. And so they've mostly landed, they've mostly been accepted. What this 5-year plan is more about is consolidation. So we already, as Rogier just pointed out, there is a different view now in China about economic growth. So before, China was all in on economic growth. We saw just growth everywhere. Xi Jinping now seems to focus more on having a stronger economy, a more resilient economy. And strength and resilience can come from different things, right? So there is a repeat insistence on self-sufficiency and self-reliance. There is the idea to consolidate the success of the Made in China 2025 program, which saw China leap ahead in so many industrial areas, right? So we also see propaganda and publicity in which China just makes clear that this is China's answer to global uncertainty. We are now in a world that is increasingly unstable, and we have increasing economic challenges everywhere. And so the Chinese model is actually something which can then, through its predictability and its leeway for crises, offer some stability, of course, both to the world, but also to the system, which of course needs to weather all these crises, because there's domestic challenges in China as well as international. And so one of the things which I think is interesting is we saw a shift, if you zoom in on the artificial intelligence sector, where China wants to dominate because this is one of the future technologies. And we see that China is still facing some bottlenecks, right? We see bottlenecks in chip production because ASML machines can't be shipped to China. We see high memory bandwidth issues and other of these problems. But rather than going all in on these individual bottlenecks, what we now see more is a shift to a focus on the whole ecosystem, the whole industrial chain. The idea being also that if you take care of the if you have such industrial strength in China to make many chips, it matters less if they are all top-notch, because you can still make enough. If you can focus on cheap energy, because you have so many power plants and you have nuclear power and renewable energy, you can also then you don't need to invest so much in making it low energy, these chips, right? And so by focusing on making a stronger system as a whole, the individual areas where they are behind should matter less. So this is, again, I think for me this document is the consolidation of a belief in China in that their industrial system offers unique strengths which they should work on, versus maybe the more founder-centric or technology-centric approach in America, where they seek to bombard individual companies or chips or people as the saving grace. So this is a very Xi Jinping document. Xi Jinping really is consolidated now. Okay, what next? So I discussed before, right, this is just the 5-year plan is just one big milestone, right? It's a 5-year policy cycle, or maybe even a 7-year if you take the preparation before the 5-year plan into regard. And so what we see now, what we'll see now is actually lower level officials giving legs to these high-flying words, right? So, of course, there's the yearly government work report by the Prime Minister. Every year they will set out a policy for the next year. That is one area in which they get a bit more concrete. They give a bit more detail in the targets they want to achieve. Also, there's provincial level 5-year plans, right? So now the provinces will get to work to develop their own. And of course, the lower down you go, the more concrete you are. So if you want to know where the next EV factories are going to be, look in the provinces, not in the national 5-year plan, because they are the ones who are really deciding on where the money goes. And of course also, because everybody has to go to the study sessions, also party members in businesses and universities and other institutions will learn about these priorities and also will then automatically adapt whatever their 5-year plan equivalent is in your business or university to align with these things, because you know that's where the government wants to go, you know that's where the money is, so you will also see that lower level organizations will start to follow what has now just been announced. And those are the places also where you want to look to see actually concrete steps being taken. Because this whole discussion just now over green growth, whatever, is not going to tell us where the areas are. And there's going to be experimentation, right? So different provinces are going to try different things. Some of those things will fail. That's by design also, right? So EV also came out of many provinces putting lots of money into EV factories based on the 5-year plans. And then some of them succeeded, some of them went bankrupt, or should be bankrupt but aren't yet because other reasons. But there is real competition between provinces, which I think also is something you have to keep in mind. And then also you might see ad hoc 3-year plans, right? So 2 years ago the government announced a 3-year plan for AI standards. So China wants to, of course, dominate these technology of the future, and so they believe standardizations are a big part of that, and they need to develop standards. So they had a 3-year plan by the relevant regulators and ministries to work on this. So these are subsidiary plans, basically, or ad hoc. And of course, you might see even like a 10-year approach, like the Made in China 2025 approach was a 10-year strategy, which was devised in 2015 to achieve certain targets in China's industrial capacity. So there's a lot more to read and a lot more to discuss. And so I think also where you want to start is by focusing on your issue areas, right? So don't read the whole document, but read the opening and then look in the chapters and the province and the localities where you have your own interests. Because China is going somewhere, because they have an idea in mind. And this is a real poster, by the way, not my own Photoshop. This is official. But don't they look nice together? But China has long-term goals as well, right? And of course, the main one is Xi Jinping's Chinese dream, which should be achieved by 2049. And so in order to get to this great rejuvenation, there are 2 milestones on the way, basically of 3 5-year plans. One is 2035, when China should achieve basic socialist modernization, and we are now in the middle of that with this 5-year plan. And then after that 15-year period, we go to the next stage to become a great modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, harmonious, and beautiful. And all of those words mean a certain policy discussion. They're not there by accident. Prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, those all refer to certain policy priorities. They're not there just because they sound nice, right? So every relevant issue area will have to show that they did something towards becoming a whole process democracy, or to making Chinese culture advance. And I think also what we see is just growing confidence. So as America is facing troubles, as Europe is also worried about the future of its industries, and we see the global south coming up and being less content with the Western countries, China believes that actually it has found the solution, right? So we see increasing confidence that China's development approach is actually superior. And they often say so explicitly, by contrasting China's development to Western, the non-real industries, welfareism, hegemonism, all of these things, which are supposedly making us weak. And so this year, I think also we saw quite a lot of presentation of the 5-year plan, not just domestically as an instruction tool to familiarize all the people with the priorities for the next 5 years, but also internationally, especially to global South countries, as propaganda for the Chinese model. The 5-year plan as an object of admiration that countries might want to strive for. I think that's quite interesting, actually, because this confidence in China's development model is also because we see more countries in the world that want to learn from this. I think they can't really, because none of them really are party states, and this is a very particular party state document. But we do, I think, see now more countries outside of the West who want to learn not just from America and Europe, but also from the Chinese approach to development. And so it's not just us who will study this document, it's also a lot of other officials elsewhere in the world. And so I think we better pay attention. I think I'll stop here for now.